As a pathologist during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, my experience was grounded in the stark reality of the healthcare crisis that unfolded around us. The job, inherently clinical and detached, became intensely personal as the death toll mounted. The hospital, a place of healing, was overwhelmed, its resources stretched to the breaking point. My work in the morgue, once a quiet and methodical examination of the deceased to determine cause of death, transformed into a relentless procession of victims claimed by the virus. The morgue, designed to respectfully handle a finite number of cases, was quickly overrun. Refrigeration units, essential for preserving the dignity of the deceased and the safety of the living, were filled beyond capacity. It was in this environment, amidst the unyielding pressure and the palpable aura of loss, that something deeply unsettling began to manifest. Late at night, while reviewing case files and preparing reports, I started to hear noises from the refrigeration units. Initially, these sounds were easy to dismiss as the byproduct of the refrigeration systems working overtime, or perhaps the settling of the building under the weight of its own exhaustion. However, as the nights progressed, the noises became harder to rationalize away. They sounded eerily human, faint moans and movements that seemed to suggest life where there should be none. Given the sheer volume of cases and the nature of my work, I was no stranger to the body's post-mortem processes, which can sometimes mimic signs of life. Yet what I was hearing seemed beyond the scope of normal biological explanations, compelled by a sense of professional responsibility and a growing concern that we might be overlooking something critical. I decided to investigate. One night, following the source of the sounds, I opened one of the refrigeration units. Inside, laid out before me, were the victims of the pandemic, each in their own body bag, tagged and cataloged in a grim testament to the virus's lethality. Selecting the bag from which I believed the noises had emanated, I braced myself for what I might find. The chill of the refrigerated air bit at my skin as I unzipped the bag and exposed the face of a man who had been pronounced dead just days earlier. What happened next is something I still struggle to fully comprehend. As I examined him for any sign of what could have caused the noises, he groaned, a low, unmistakable sound of distress. His chest rose and fell weakly, a clear indication of shallow breathing. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This man was not dead. My immediate reaction was a mixture of shock and disbelief, quickly followed by a surge of adrenaline as I called for medical assistance. The hospital's response was swift, but it was also shrouded in a level of secrecy that matched the severity of the mistake we had uncovered. An investigation confirmed a horrifying truth. In the chaos of the pandemic and the overwhelming number of deaths, a critical error had been made. This man, presumed dead from COVID-19, was actually in a deep coma, alive but barely so. The implications of this discovery were profound, not just for the man and his family, but for the entire hospital staff. It forced use to confront the possibility that our protocols and processes, pushed to their limits by the pandemic, might fail us in the most unthinkable ways. The hospital management, prioritizing the institution's reputation over the grave mistake, opted for silence, burying the truth in layers of bureaucracy and non-disclosure agreements. As for me, the experience left me deeply shaken. The trust I had in our systems and our ability to care for the dead and the living alike was irrevocably damaged. After much deliberation, I made the difficult decision to leave the hospital. The need to distance myself from the events of those dark months was overwhelming, a testament to the personal and professional toll the pandemic exacted on those of us who served on its front lines.
In the deep, unsettling quiet of our small home, I sat next to Gerald, my husband of 40 years. It was our third week into what the doctors called a mild case of COVID-19. We were supposed to be the lucky ones, experiencing nothing more than a persistent cough and a fever that came and went like an unwelcome guest. Our days were marked by the routine taking of temperatures and the constant hum of the news, reporting the relentless march of the pandemic outside our walls. I remember looking at Gerald that evening. His brow was furrowed, not with the usual lines of wisdom and laughter, but with something akin to pain or deep discomfort. I reached out, my hand shaking slightly as I touched his forehead. It was burning up, a stark contrast to his otherwise cold, clammy skin. "Let me call Dr. Simmons," I suggested, trying to keep the worry from my voice. But Gerald, usually so responsive to my concern, barely acknowledged me. His eyes, typically warm and full of life, now seemed distant, lost in some unseen nightmare. The digital numbers on the thermometer confirmed my fears. 103 degree F. I dialed for an ambulance, my heart pounding against my chest, as if trying to escape the reality of what was happening. The wait for the ambulance was agonizing, each minute stretching longer than the last. I sat beside Gerald, whispering words of comfort, more for myself than for him. It was then that the night took a turn into the surreal. Gerald, who had been lying so still, suddenly convulsed. His body shook violently, a puppet in the grip of an unseen force. I cried out, frozen in shock, as his eyes snapped open. They were no longer his eyes. They were void of any warmth, any recognition. They were the eyes of a stranger, cold and terrifying. His voice followed, a sound so alien and distorted that it chilled me to my core. It was as if something else was speaking through him, using his body as a vessel. The words were twisted, incomprehensible at times, but filled with such malice and doom. He spoke of end times, of apocalyptic visions that centered on me, his wife, the woman he had loved for decades. His accusations were nonsensical, yet they cut through me, leaving me breathless and cold. I backed away, my mind reeling. This wasn't the illness we had read about, the one the doctors had warned us of. This was something else, something far more sinister. As the sound of sirens finally pierced the night, signaling the arrival of the ambulance, I felt a surge of relief mixed with a deep, unshakable dread. I knew, as I watched the paramedics enter our home, that the nightmare was only just beginning. Gerald, still in the throes of his inexplicable transformation, lay convulsing on our bed. His voice continued to spew venomous curses and apocalyptic proclamations. The words, twisted and dark, seemed to hang heavily in the room, as if imbued with a malevolent life of their own. The paramedics approached with caution, their eyes wide with a mixture of professional concern and palpable fear. One of them attempted to speak to Gerald, to calm him, but the words were lost in the chaos. Gerald's response was to lash out, his arms flailing with a strength that seemed impossible for his weakened state. His skin, slick with sweat and marred by lesions oozing pus, became a grotesque sight that etched itself into my memory. I watched, horror-stricken, as the paramedics struggled to restrain him. Gerald's resistance was fierce and unrelenting, his body contorting in ways that defied explanation. Finally, they managed to secure Gerald onto a stretcher, but not without effort. His body continued to thrash, even as they wheeled him out of the bedroom. His voice, now a guttural growl, echoed down the hallway. I followed them out, my legs barely able to carry my weight, my mind struggling to process the nightmare unfolding before my eyes. As they loaded Gerald into the ambulance, his curses continued, each word a dagger aimed at my heart. The ride to the hospital was a blur. I was not allowed to accompany Gerald in the ambulance, a restriction of the pandemic protocols. Instead, I drove behind in a daze, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, my heart racing with fear and confusion. Arriving at the hospital, I was met with a scene of controlled chaos. Doctors and nurses moved with purpose, their faces etched with the strain of battling an unseen enemy. I tried to explain what had happened, to convey the unnatural, terrifying transformation that had befallen Gerald, but my words felt inadequate, lost in the magnitude of the crisis that surrounded us. They took Gerald away, disappearing behind doors marked restricted access, leaving me alone in the waiting area, my mind a whirlwind of fear and unanswered questions. The hospital waiting room was a cold, sterile place, echoing with the distant sounds of urgency and despair. It was here, under the harsh fluorescent lights, that I sat alone, my mind replaying the night's horrors over and over. The clock on the wall ticked monotonously, marking the passage of time in a world that seemed to have lost all sense. Hours passed, each minute stretching into an eternity of uncertainty and dread. Then, a doctor approached me, his face obscured by a mask, his eyes revealing nothing but a professional detachment. The news he delivered was succinct, emotionless. Gerald had passed away. His words struck me like a physical blow. I felt a surge of grief, a profound sense of loss that was quickly overshadowed by confusion and frustration. I asked for details, desperate for some understanding of what had happened, but the doctor was evasive. His responses were vague, skirting around my questions with clinical indifference. When I demanded to see Gerald, to say my final goodbye, I was met with a firm denial. "It's not possible," the doctor said, citing the risks associated with the virus and the hospital's protocols. But his words felt hollow, an excuse that masked something deeper, something unspoken. There was a strange air about him, a sense of unease that he seemed to carry. I left the hospital with a heavy heart, my mind swirling with unanswered questions. The drive home was a blur, the world outside seeming unreal, as if I were moving through a dream. The silence of our home was suffocating, each room echoing with the memories of Gerald, of the love we had shared, and of the terrifying transformation that had torn him away from me. I replayed every moment, every word spoken in that inhuman voice, searching for answers that remained elusive. The curses, the dark prophecies, they haunted my dreams, a constant reminder of the nightmare that had invaded our lives. In the spring of 2020, during the height of the pandemic lockdown, I found solace in the virtual world. It was during this period of isolation that I met Steve through a mutual interest group on Facebook. We bonded over our shared love for psychological thrillers and classic cinema, a connection that seemed to offer a reprieve from the world's chaos. As weeks turned into months, our conversations grew deeper and more personal. Steve was charismatic and engaging, often sharing stories of his travels and experiences. However, there was an intensity to him that I couldn't quite place, a fervor in his words that sometimes bordered on unsettling. The first sign of something amiss was when Steve casually mentioned he had seen me at the local grocery store. I had never shared my location or routine with him. I brushed it off as a coincidence, attributing it to the small size of our town. But then it happened again. This time he texted, "I noticed you at the park yesterday. You seemed lost in thought." A chill ran down my spine. How did he know where I was? My discomfort grew as Steve's messages became increasingly detailed. He knew which cafe I frequented, the time I usually went for my evening run, even the layout of my apartment complex. I confronted him, and his response was a dismissive chuckle. "I'm just observant, that's all." One evening, I returned home to find a note pinned to my door. "You looked beautiful in red today." My heart sank. I hadn't worn red since the video call with Steve earlier that week. The realization hit me hard. He had been physically stalking me. I reported him to the police, but they were hesitant to take action without solid evidence of a threat. Meanwhile, Steve's behavior escalated. He sent me messages describing violent fantasies, detailing how he wanted to claim me and how no one else could have me. His words were a toxic mixture of obsession and aggression. The final straw came one night when I woke up to the sound of breaking glass. I found Steve inside my apartment, his face twisted in a manic grin. I just wanted to be closer to you," he said, advancing towards me. The next moments were a blur of terror. I remember screaming, the struggle, the sharp pain as he slashed at me with a knife he had brought. I managed to escape and lock myself in the bathroom, where I called the police. They arrived quickly and arrested Steve. He had inflicted deep cuts on my arms and legs, but I was alive. The officers later told me that Steve had been planning this for weeks, monitoring my movements, learning my routines. The aftermath was a nightmare. I was left with not just physical scars, but psychological ones. The feeling of safety in my own home, the sense of normalcy in my daily life, was shattered. As I recovered, I grappled with the reality that the digital connections we make, the seemingly harmless interactions online, can sometimes harbor dark intentions. I learned the hard way that the line between the virtual world and the real one can be terrifyingly thin, and the monsters we chat with online can sometimes step out from behind the screen. In the weeks following the break-in, my life was a relentless cycle of police statements, hospital visits, and sleepless nights. The physical wounds were healing, but the psychological scars ran deep. The police investigation revealed disturbing details about Steve's obsession. They found his apartment plastered with photos of me, some taken from social media, others captured without my knowledge. His computer contained detailed notes on my daily routines, and a diary he kept was filled with delusional ramblings about our destined relationship. But the most chilling discovery was a collection of knives and ropes, along with a plan detailing how he intended to abduct me. The police said I was lucky to have survived that night. Steve had intended to take me to a remote cabin he had prepared. As I tried to piece my life back together, I was constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at every sound. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even though Steve was in custody. Nightmares plagued me, vivid, terrifying dreams where I relived the attack or imagined what could have happened if I hadn't escaped. The court case loomed over me like a dark cloud. Facing Steve again, this time in a courtroom, was a prospect that filled me with dread. Yet, I knew it was necessary for justice to be served. The trial was a harrowing experience. Steve's defense tried to paint him as a lovesick individual who had simply gone too far, but the evidence of his meticulous planning and violent intentions was overwhelming. During the trial, Steve's demeanor was unsettlingly calm. He would often stare at me, a faint smile playing on his lips, as if we shared a secret. When he took the stand, his testimony was a mix of twisted justifications and declarations of love. Hearing his warped perspective on our interactions, twisted into a narrative where I was somehow a willing participant in his fantasy, was sickening. The jury found Steve guilty of aggravated stalking, breaking and entering, and attempted kidnapping. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, but the relief I felt was tempered by the knowledge that the trauma he inflicted would linger. After the trial, I left town. The memories and the sense of violation were too much to bear. I started over in a new city, far from the shadows of the past. But the ordeal had changed me. I was wary of new connections, both online and in person. I had seen firsthand how quickly fascination can turn into fixation, and how the digital footprints we leave can be traced by those with dark intentions.